My in-laws replaced me with their so-called perfect daughter-in-law, and they thought I'd just sit back and take it. My name is Emily Carter, I'm in my late 20s, and for years I believed I was building a happy marriage with my husband Daniel. I wasn't perfect, but I tried my hardest to be the kind of wife and daughter-in-law anyone would be proud of. I cooked for every holiday, stayed up late cleaning after big family dinners, and even helped Daniel's parents, Margaret and Charles, with money when they needed it. I thought we were family, but no matter what I did, it was never enough for them. Margaret would look at me with that cold smile and remind me how Daniel's ex-girlfriend was more polished. Charles would make little comments about how I wasn't as ambitious as I should be. At first, I told myself it was just nitpicking, but over time the digs grew sharper, and I could feel my place in their eyes shrinking. The breaking point came when they introduced me to Jessica. She was tall, elegant, and dripping with charm, and from the second Margaret met her, it was like I had disappeared. Suddenly, every conversation was about how Jessica would have done this better, or Jessica is such a natural at that. It wasn't just comparisons anymore, it was replacement. What hurt most was how Daniel began to change. The same man who once defended me now stood silently when his parents mocked. Slowly, he started joining in. He'd comment on my clothes, my cooking, even how I spoke. I tried harder, cooking elaborate meals, dressing up, bending over backward to keep him happy. But the more I tried, the colder he became. I still remember the night I realized I was losing him. We had just come home from one of Margaret's dinners where Jessica had been paraded in front of everyone. I asked Daniel if he saw how his mother treated me. He sighed, wouldn't meet my eyes, and said quietly, "Jessica just fits in better." That sentence cut deeper than anything else. In that moment, it felt like the life I had built was slipping through my fingers, and no matter how hard I clawed, I couldn't hold on. My husband, the man I sacrificed so much for, was letting his parents hand him another woman as if I were disposable. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. It started small, almost too small to notice. One night, Daniel pushed his plate aside and said the chicken was dry. Another evening, he told me the dress I picked looked a little off. Soon it was the way I said certain words, the way I laughed, even how I sat at the table. Nothing about me seemed to please him anymore, and the man who once looked at me with warmth now studied me as if I were an embarrassment. Margaret fed the fire every chance she got. She'd smile at me politely in front of others, but her comments always had teeth. If I brought a pie, she'd sigh and say Jessica's crust was flakier. If I poured wine, she'd remark that Jessica's hands were more graceful. Every sentence was a comparison, every word a reminder that I was falling short of some standard they had set without telling me. And Daniel, instead of shutting it down, seemed to let their voices echo in his head until they became his own. I couldn't stand the tension, so I started changing myself piece by piece. I cut back on things I enjoyed because I thought maybe my hobbies annoyed him. I bought clothes I didn't like because I hoped he'd approve. When Margaret mentioned how Jessica kept herself busy with useful work, Daniel asked me why I hadn't considered leaving my job to focus more on the home. The suggestion stung, but I wanted peace so badly that I handed in my resignation. The first weeks without work were strange. I filled the days with cleaning, cooking, planning little surprises for Daniel, convinced that if I poured everything into being the wife he wanted, things would return to how they used to be. But every gesture was dismissed. If I baked bread, he said the crust was too thick. If I dressed up for him, he'd mutter that it wasn't my style. Even the house, polished to a shine, earned nothing more than a glance. What cut deepest wasn't the words themselves, but the tone. He didn't sound like Daniel anymore. He sounded like Margaret. He sounded like Jessica. Each sentence carried their judgment, their superiority, their disdain, and I was losing the man I married to their influence. I had given up my career, my independence, and even parts of myself in the hope of winning him back. But the colder he grew, the clearer it became that my sacrifices only fed their control. I was fighting for a place in a life that was no longer mine. Thanksgiving arrived, and I poured every ounce of energy I had into making it perfect. I woke before sunrise, filling the kitchen with the smell of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and butter. Hours went into setting the table, arranging flowers, and folding napkins with care. By the time everyone gathered, the house was warm and glowing, and I felt a flicker of hope that maybe this effort would remind them who I was to this family. Margaret walked in, looked over the spread, and her lips curved into a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. Without hesitation, she waved her hand and called for Jessica to bring out her dish. Mine was brushed aside as if all those hours had been a waste. My roasted turkey, the casseroles, the pies, all of it carried to the trash, replaced by Jessica's single pan of stuffing. No explanation, no kindness, just a dismissal so sharp it left me standing frozen by the table. I searched Daniel's face, desperate for him to speak up, to defend me, to stop the humiliation. But he stayed silent. He didn't protest when Margaret declared Jessica's food the highlight of the night. He didn't blink when the family gathered around her, showering her with praise as though I hadn't lifted a finger. It was as if I wasn't even there, like the years I had spent giving myself to this family had been erased in one cruel gesture. Throughout dinner, I moved quietly, setting plates, refilling glasses, and pretending not to notice the way everyone leaned toward Jessica. My heart pounded in my chest, each laugh and compliment twisting deeper into me. I wanted to disappear, but pride held me in place. By the time the last dish was cleared, I felt hollow, like a guest in my own home. That night, after everyone left, I asked Daniel why he let it happen. I needed some sign that he still saw me, still valued me. He didn't meet my eyes. He only muttered that Jessica seemed more in tune with his parents, more suited to their expectations. Then he said the words that cut everything in me to pieces. She feels more like a partner than you do. The silence that followed was heavier than any fight we had ever had. In that moment, I understood. I wasn't just unwanted. I had been replaced completely. His parents had made their choice, and now so had he. The weeks after Thanksgiving carried a silence so sharp it felt like glass under my skin. Daniel avoided me at every turn. His voice clipped when he spoke at all. One evening, while I cleared the dinner table, he sat across from me with that expression I had come to dread, detached, rehearsed. He folded his hands and told me calmly that he wanted a divorce. He said it wasn't about anger or resentment, just practicality. It's what's best for everyone, he claimed, as though dismantling our life together could ever be described as best. I asked if he was certain, hoping for the smallest crack in his certainty, but he didn't waver. The decision had been made long before he said the words out loud. Within days, he packed his things and moved out. Rumors reached me faster than I expected. Daniel wasn't alone. He had gone straight to Jessica, settling into her space as if he had been waiting for the invitation all along. Margaret and Charles wasted no time either. Their coldness toward me turned into open hostility. At gatherings, I was no longer welcome, yet my name was dragged through their conversations. Friends of the family repeated the things they said. How I had failed Daniel, how Jessica had brought dignity back into their lives. In public, they paraded her around as though she had always been their chosen one, smiling proudly as though my existence had been an unfortunate mistake finally corrected. It wasn't just my marriage I lost. The home Daniel and I built together slipped through my hands as well. Every corner of it carried memories of promises we once made, and walking through those rooms felt unbearable. Signing the papers meant more than ending a legal bond. It meant closing the door on the family I thought I belonged to. The day I left, I didn't make a scene. I packed my belongings in silence, loaded the car, and drove away without a backward glance. But inside me, something stirred that wasn't grief. Beneath the sorrow, beneath the betrayal, there was a steady flame of resolve. They had taken my place, stripped me of my role, and cast me aside as though I were nothing. Yet I knew one thing with absolute clarity: I would not remain broken. They believed I would fade, that I would vanish quietly while they celebrated their new beginning. Instead, I swore to myself as I turned the key in my new apartment door. Everything they stole, every ounce of dignity they tried to erase, I would reclaim. And when the time came, they would see what it meant to lose everything. The apartment was small, barely more than a living room, a bedroom, and a kitchen that rattled every time the fridge kicked on. But it was mine. For the first time in years, I closed a door and felt no eyes on me, no criticism humming in the air. The silence was unfamiliar, but it was also a beginning. I stacked my boxes against the wall, unrolled a thin mattress, and told myself this was where I would start again. Each morning I rose early, forcing myself to create a routine. Coffee in a chipped mug, a walk through the quiet streets, and then hours spent updating my resume. I hadn't worked in years, not since Daniel had pressed me to step back, but I still had my license, and the skills I once set aside came rushing back the more I studied. Real estate had always been mine, long before marriage tied me to someone else's vision of my life. I called old contacts, sent emails, and within weeks, I secured my first listing. At first, the jobs were modest. Small houses in need of fixing up, couples on tight budgets looking for their first place. I threw myself into every showing, every negotiation, and with each successful closing, I felt my spine straighten a little more. The paycheck was important, but even more valuable was the confidence that came with proving I could stand on my own. I learned to manage money with care. Instead of leaning on anyone else, I mapped out budgets late into the night, studied investments, and tucked away every spare dollar. I didn't splurge, not even when temptation whispered. Every choice I made was deliberate, every step a stone in the foundation of a future that belonged solely to me. I never reached out to Daniel or his parents. Their names no longer left my lips, but I couldn't help hearing about them through others. I heard whispers of their outings, their grand appearances with Jessica at their side, the way they played the role of a perfect family. I didn't react, not aloud, but deep inside I watched. Not through conversation, not through contact, but simply by keeping my ears open. Their world seemed glossy and polished, but I knew enough about appearances to understand how fragile they could be. Nights in my apartment were quiet, the kind of quiet that used to scare me but now felt steady. I cooked meals for myself, ate at my little table, and filled the space with the sound of my own music. With every month that passed, I grew stronger. I was no longer the woman who bent to please people who would never be satisfied. I was someone building, brick by brick, a life that no one could strip from me again. And though I carried myself as if they no longer existed, deep down I was waiting and watching for the cracks in their carefully painted picture. It began with whispers I didn't ask for. At open houses, in coffee shops, through mutual acquaintances who still floated between circles, little fragments of news reached me. None of it was sought out, yet every piece painted a picture I couldn't ignore. Daniel's perfect life with Jessica wasn't holding together the way they wanted the world to believe. I learned she had expensive tastes, handbags that cost more than a month's rent, shopping trips that ended with the back seat of their car piled high with bags. She liked to host parties too, the kind where champagne flowed and bills arrived larger than their income could manage. While she spent, Margaret tried to steer the household as if it were still hers. She criticized the way Jessica decorated, questioned how she cooked, and reminded Daniel of how things should be done. What had once seemed like harmony between them had curdled into constant tension. The debt came quickly. I overheard someone at a closing mention how Daniel had taken out loans, trying to keep up with Jessica's habits and his parents' demand. The weight of it pulled him under, and for the first time, I felt no guilt in knowing his world was cracking. He had chosen this path. While their foundation shook, mine solidified. My business gained momentum faster than I imagined. Clients referred me to friends referred me to family, and soon my calendar was full of showings and closings. Every commission added to my savings, and after careful searching, I signed the papers on a place of my own, a house with wide windows, sun spilling across the floors, and enough space to breathe. I carried the keys in my pocket like a treasure, each step through those rooms a reminder that I had built this life myself. Independence tasted sweeter than I expected. I furnished the rooms at my pace, celebrated milestones with people who truly cared, and watched as my reputation in the industry grew. No one hovered over my shoulder, no one whispered comparisons, no one belittled my choices. I thrived because I finally stood alone. Occasionally, I'd hear another update, another fight, another financial slip, another piece of evidence that the facade was thinning. I never repeated what I heard, never gloated, never sought them out. Instead, I kept it tucked away inside me like a quiet truth. And in the stillness of my evenings, when I walked through the home I earned with my own hands, I couldn't help the small smile that would rise. Not out of cruelty, but out of recognition. What they had stolen, I had rebuilt tenfold. And what they thought they had gained was unraveling in their hands. Karma didn't need my help. It was already at work. Years passed before their names found their way back into my life. I was at my desk, reviewing a contract, when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was one I hadn't heard in so long, I almost didn't recognize. Margaret, careful and deliberate, asked if we could meet. She spoke as though time had softened everything, as though we were old friends catching up. Against my better judgment, curiosity pulled me in. We met at a quiet cafe. Charles was with her, shoulders hunched, eyes darting like a man carrying shame he couldn't hide. They started with pleasantries, words laced with false warmth, but their smiles cracked quickly. Beneath the surface, desperation bled through. They told me Daniel was in trouble. Jessica's spending had bled him dry, and his attempts to keep pace had buried him under debt. Margaret's voice trembled as she admitted that Jessica had all but abandoned him once the money ran out. The woman they had chosen over me had taken everything and left behind ruin. Charles leaned forward, his hands clasped as if in prayer. He said they now realized what they'd lost, that I had been steady, generous, reliable. He even called me the best thing that ever happened to our family. The words might have moved me once, but hearing them now, they rang hollow. They weren't born of love or clarity. They were born of need. I let them talk, their pleas spilling across the table, their voices growing smaller each time I remained silent. They wanted financial help, advice, maybe even forgiveness that could ease their burden. But sitting there, I felt nothing. No anger, no longing, no ache for the past. Just a clean, empty space where they used to live inside me. I had built a life they knew nothing about, one that didn't require their approval or inclusion. Listening to them beg only confirmed what I already understood. They hadn't come to make peace. They had come because they had nowhere else to turn. When Margaret reached across the table, trying to take my hand, I pulled back gently. I told them I was glad they had found the courage to be honest, but I couldn't give them what they were asking for. My voice was steady, my heart untouched. We parted with their eyes heavy and mine clear. For years, they believed I was replaceable. Now they sat across from me, stripped of pride, asking for the very woman they cast aside. I walked away without looking back, carrying nothing from them but the reminder that I no longer owed them a single piece of myself. They asked to see me again not long after that first meeting, as though my refusal had been a temporary answer instead of a final one. This time I agreed, but not out of sympathy. I wanted them to hear the truth, not the softened version they could twist into something convenient. We sat in a small room at the back of a restaurant, the kind meant for private gathering. Margaret tried to begin with apologies, rehearsed lines that sounded like they had been practiced in the mirror. Charles nodded along, adding phrases about misunderstandings and mistakes. Their voices carried the weight of pleading, but their eyes still searched for loopholes, hoping I might offer them an escape. I let them speak until their words tangled on themselves, until silence pressed down. Then I reminded them, slowly, carefully. I repeated the comments they had once tossed at me, as if I couldn't feel the sting. The night Margaret tossed out my cooking in front of everyone. The times Charles praised Jessica while I stood beside him, invisible. The day Daniel told me another woman was a better partner, with their encouragement ringing in his ear. Each memory I laid before them like stones, heavy and undeniable. Their faces shifted with each recollection. Margaret's lips tightened, her hands fidgeting against the tablecloth. Charles sank lower in his chair, his earlier resolve slipping away. I didn't raise my voice, didn't let anger control me. My words were calm, deliberate, sharper than any scream could ever be. I wanted them to feel the weight of their actions without distraction, to sit in the silence that followed each reminder. When I finished, I told them simply that they had made their choices. They wanted Jessica. They wanted a version of family that excluded me. And now they could live with the outcome. I stood, collected my things, and left without waiting for a reply. As I reached the door, I heard it, a choked sound, raw and unguarded. Margaret had broken. Her voice cracked as she whispered something I couldn't quite make out, but the pain in it was clear. She knew, perhaps for the first time, that the life they once had was gone because of their own doing. No rival, no outside force, just the slow destruction they had orchestrated with their own hands. I didn't turn back. I walked out into the night, breathing air that felt clean and free. My silence had been louder than any rage could have been. I left them behind in the ruin they built, and for the first time in years, I felt no shadow clinging to me. It was late in the evening when I heard the knock. Firm, hurried, almost desperate. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment I considered ignoring it. But something made me open the door, and there he was. Daniel, standing on my porch, shoulders slumped, eyes hollow. The man who once walked away so easily now looked as though life had wrung every ounce of pride from him. He tried to smile at first, but it faltered quickly. Words tumbled out of him in a rush. Jessica was gone. She had drained what little money he had left, and left without looking back. His parents, once so confident in their choice, were now struggling themselves, weighed down by the consequences of their own mistakes. He admitted he had nothing left, no partner, no support, no foundation. He said he missed what we used to have, that he finally saw how much I had given him. I stood in the doorway, listening as he unraveled. His voice cracked, his hands gestured helplessly, as though reaching for a life that had slipped beyond his grasp. Every sentence was a confession, not of love, not even of remorse, but of need. He longed for the stability I had once provided, the life he had taken for granted until it was gone. For a moment, I searched myself for the ache that used to live there, the part of me that would have leapt at his return. But it was gone. All that remained was clarity. I remembered the nights I begged for his support and heard only silence. I remembered the weight of humiliation, the sound of his agreement when others tore me down. Those memories stood between us like a wall I had no intention of climbing again. When he finally stopped speaking, he looked at me with eyes full of hope, as if waiting for me to open the door wider, to invite him back into the life he had destroyed. Instead, I met his gaze steadily and gave him the only answer I had. You replaced me once. I won't give you a second chance. The words hung in the air, final and immovable. Before he could respond, I closed the door. The latch clicked, and with it, something inside me settled. I had not shouted, had not argued, had not explained myself. I had simply chosen. On the other side of that door was the man who had gambled everything and lost. On my side was the woman who had built herself back up, stronger, untouchable. I leaned against the quiet of my home and knew I had reclaimed what he thought I'd never find again, my power. The seasons shifted, and with each passing year, my world grew brighter. The house I had chosen for myself became more than walls and a roof. It became a sanctuary. Sunlight poured through wide windows in the mornings, and laughter from friends filled the rooms at night. I had people around me who valued me for who I was, not for what I could provide or how I could measure up to impossible standards. With them, I was not invisible. I was seen, heard, and cherished. My career soared further than I imagined. Listings that once felt out of reach became everyday business. Clients trusted me, respected me, and returned again and again with referrals. I managed my finances with care, investing wisely, and over time, I built more than security. I built freedom. I traveled when I wanted, hosted gatherings on my own terms, and looked in the mirror each morning knowing I owed no one but myself for the life I now live. Meanwhile, news of the others reached me less and less, fading like background noise. The once proud family who had dismissed me so easily no longer held the spotlight they craved. Their stories trickled out through whispers. Daniel stumbling from one failed attempt to another, Margaret and Charles retreating into the quiet of their mistakes, Jessica disappearing into the same shadows she once seemed to shine from. Their choices had carved their path, and they were left to walk it without the applause they once demanded. I never needed to seek them out or prove them wrong. Their downfall required no hand from me. They had undone themselves piece by piece, guided by arrogance and cruelty. What they thought was victory had only been the beginning of their undoing. My silence, my distance, had been the sharpest response of all. In contrast, my days were filled with peace. I planted flowers in my garden, watched them bloom, and realized that every part of my life was now something I had nurtured on my own. No one could take it from me. No one could replace me within it. That truth wrapped around me like armor, soft yet unbreakable. One evening, as I stood on my porch watching the sky turn gold, I thought about the way they once boasted about their perfect daughter-in-law. The memory no longer hurt. It simply confirmed how blind they had been. And with a steady breath, I gave myself the last word, even if no one else would hear it but me. They replaced me with their perfect daughter-in-law. Turns out, I was irreplaceable. Do you think I made the right choice by walking away for good? Or should I have given them another chance? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for more stories.